I wanted to share the story that's been haunting me for years. I've never been able to shake off the eerie feeling that I narrowly escaped something truly horrifying. It all happened when I was just out of high school and ready to explore my newfound freedom. My friends and I decided to go on a camping trip that we thought would be an unforgettable adventure, but not for the reasons we expected. We planned a road trip to Apalachicola National Forest in Florida, which is about 7 hours from where we lived. The goal was simple: camp, drink some cheap beer, and feel like we were on top of the world. You know, typical teenage stuff. We were trying to avoid any park rangers, so we drove way deep into the woods, far from any designated camping spots. It felt like we were the only people in the world, completely isolated and free. We were pretty excited. After setting up camp, we cracked open a few beers, set up our tents, and just chilled under the stars. The forest was so dense that even the moonlight barely filtered through the trees. It was the perfect spot: quiet, remote, and just a little bit creepy. After a while, the buzz from the beer kicked in, and my buddy and I got the bright idea to explore a bit. There was this narrow, overgrown path that led away from our campsite, and our curiosity got the better of us. We grabbed a couple of flashlights and wandered off, laughing and stumbling a bit as we went. We didn't walk too far before we noticed some strange signs that someone had been living out there. Big trash bags were piled up, and there was random junk scattered around, stuff like old clothes, broken camping gear, and even a couple of beat-up coolers. It looked like someone had been there for a while. At this point, any sane person would have turned around and headed back to camp. But we were young and invincible. Nothing could touch us, or so we thought. So we kept walking, and soon enough we stumbled upon an old van in a small clearing. The van looked like it had been there for years, and it was surrounded by a makeshift camp. Clotheslines were strung between the trees, and a big, friendly-looking dog was lying next to the van. It seemed so out of place, like a scene from some creepy movie. Before we could even think about leaving, the guy who owned the van came out. He was an older man, probably in his 50s or 60s, with scruffy hair and clothes that definitely had seen better days. He was a little off-kilter, swaying slightly as he walked over to us, but he had a big smile on his face and greeted us like we were old friends. We were a bit on edge, but he seemed harmless enough, so we chatted with him for a while. He asked us where we were from and what we were doing so far out in the woods. We told him about our camping trip, and he started talking about all the different parks and forests he had been to. The guy seemed really passionate about nature, which didn't seem that weird at first. But what did strike me as odd was how he gave directions. Instead of using miles or even yards, he talked in steps like, "Take 50 steps this way, and you'll find a great fishing spot." It was so specific, and he was really into it. There was just something off about the way he spoke and moved, like he was always a little unsteady on his feet. We wrapped up the conversation after about 10 minutes, said goodbye, and headed back to our camp. As we walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something strange about the whole encounter, but I brushed it off. We laughed about it later around the campfire, joking that we'd met some kind of forest hermit or crazy mountain man. We didn't think much more of it after that. The rest of the trip was pretty uneventful, just the usual camping stuff, drinking, telling stories, and trying to scare each other in the dark. Eventually, we packed up and headed home, leaving the forest and that weird guy behind. A couple of months passed, and I had almost forgotten about the whole thing. Then one night, I got a call from my friend, the same one who'd been with me when we met the guy in the woods. He sounded really freaked out and told me to turn on the TV to a specific news channel. I was confused but did as he said, and that's when I saw it. The van, the same one we'd seen in the forest, parked in that same clearing. My jaw dropped as the news anchor began reporting on a man who had been arrested for violently taking the lives of multiple people across several states. The camera zoomed in on the man's face, and I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. It was him, the guy we'd met in the woods, who chatted with us so casually, was a serial killer. He had been targeting campers and hikers in remote areas, luring them in with his friendly demeanor before doing unspeakable things. My mind flashed back to the directions he'd given us, the way he'd seemed so excited to talk about those parks and forests. It all clicked into place in the most horrifying way possible. I was in shock, barely able to process what I was seeing. My friend was yelling into the phone, asking if I remembered that dog, the one that had been lying by the van. Apparently, the dog was how the authorities had finally tracked him down. It had been spotted at one of the crime scenes. I stood there frozen in place and realized just how close we'd come to being his next victims. The next few days were a blur of phone calls and meetings with law enforcement. We were contacted by the FBI and flown down to Florida to help with the investigation. They took us back to the campsite where we'd met him, and we retraced our steps, pointing out every detail we could remember. The whole time, I kept thinking about how easily things could have gone wrong. If we'd stayed with him just a little longer, or if we'd come across him in a different mood, who knows what might have happened. The trial that followed was surreal. We were called to testify about our encounter, and I learned things that still haunt me. The investigators found remains near the campsite, human bones, partially burned and buried. They showed us photos of the other victims, and it took everything I had not to break down right there in the courtroom. The whole experience left me shaken to my core. To this day, I can't go camping without thinking about that trip, about how close we came to something truly horrific. The forest, once a place of adventure and freedom, now feels tainted. I still love nature, but there's always a part of me that's on edge, watching for any sign of danger. I guess that's the price I paid for being young and naive, for thinking I was untouchable. A couple of years ago, my buddy Carson and I decided to go on a camping trip deep in the Carolina mountains. We both love the outdoors and were no strangers to venturing off the beaten path. This time, we wanted a real adventure, away from the usual campsites, away from other people, just us, the wilderness, and the peacefulness of nature. We planned meticulously, packing everything we'd need for a few nights. We chose a spot that was miles away from any marked trail. It was the kind of place you'd only find if you knew exactly where to look. Carson had been there before, a long time ago, and he assured me it was perfect. No one would bother us, he said. We could set up camp, fish in the nearby stream, and just relax. The hike in was grueling. The trail, if you could even call it that, was overgrown and barely visible. We had to bushwhack our way through the dense thickets, our backpacks snagging on branches every few steps. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, and the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the occasional bird making some noise. It was exhausting, but also exhilarating. This was exactly what we wanted, complete isolation. We reached the spot by late afternoon. It was everything Carson had described. A small clearing surrounded by towering trees with a clear stream running nearby. The ground was soft, covered in a thick layer of pine needles. We set up our tent, gathered some firewood, and started a small fire as the sun dipped low in the sky. By the time we'd finished eating, it was dark. The fire was flickering shadows around the clearing, and the stars were just beginning to appear. We sat by the fire, talking and laughing, enjoying the stillness. It was peaceful, almost eerily so. There wasn't even the usual hum of insects you'd expect in the woods at night, just silence. It wasn't long before we started to feel that something was off. At first, it was just a vague unease, a feeling like we were being watched. I chalked it up to paranoia. After all, we were miles from civilization. Who could possibly be out here with us? But the feeling persisted. I noticed Carson was quieter than usual, too. He kept glancing over his shoulder into the darkness as if he was expecting to see someone there. "Do you hear that?" Carson asked suddenly, his voice low. I strained my ears but heard nothing. "Hear what?" "Footsteps," he whispered. "Over there, in the trees." I listened again, harder this time, but all I could hear was the crackling of the fire and the occasional pop of a burning log. "I don't hear anything, man. It's probably just an animal." Carson didn't look convinced, but he nodded and tried to shake it off. We went back to our conversation, but the mood had shifted. The unease was no longer subtle. It was intense, hanging heavy in the air like a storm cloud. I just couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. A few hours later, we decided to call it a night. We doused the fire and crawled into the tent. Carson fell asleep almost immediately, but I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something, a twig snapping, leaves rustling, the faintest hint of movement just outside the tent. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me in the dark. I was completely exhausted and I finally drifted off, but my sleep was restless. I woke up in the middle of the night, sure that I'd heard something. I lay there, holding my breath, listening intently. There it was again, footsteps, unmistakable this time. Slow, but distinct, and far too heavy to be an animal. They circled the tent, crunching softly on the pine needles. My mind raced, trying to come up with a rational explanation, but none of them made sense. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere, walking around our camp in the dead of night? I reached over and shook Carson awake. "Dude, wake up. There's something out there." He groaned and rubbed his eyes, clearly annoyed. "What are you talking about?" "Listen," I whispered. The footsteps had stopped, as if whatever was out there knew we were awake. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on us from all sides. Then, after a minute or two, the footsteps started again, this time moving away from the tent, deeper into the woods. Carson was fully awake now, and I could see the fear in his eyes. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely audible. "But it's now gone, right?" We lay there in tense silence, neither of us able to move or speak. I kept expecting the footsteps to return, to hear the sound of something or someone approaching the tent again. But after a while, the forest was silent again, and eventually, exhaustion overtook fear, and we both fell asleep. The next morning, we woke up early, the events of the night before still fresh in our minds. We stepped outside the tent. The cool morning air was super refreshing. As we made our way to the stream to get cleaned up, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened the night before. When we returned to the campsite, I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the dirt, clear as day, circling our tent. Human footprints. But there was something strange about them, like they'd been made by someone walking barefoot, the toes digging into the earth at odd angles. The prints led around the tent a few times before disappearing into the undergrowth. "Carson, look at this," I called, pointing to the tracks. He came over and his face turned pale as he saw what I was pointing at. "No way. There's no way those are from us. We would have noticed them last night and we were never barefoot out here," I said, my voice shaking. Someone was out here. Someone was watching us. Carson looked around, scanning the trees with a panicked expression. "We should get out of here." I couldn't have agreed more. We packed up camp as quickly as we could, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig making us jump. The sense of being watched grew stronger with each passing minute, and by the time we were ready to leave, we were both in a slight state of panic. The hike back was a nightmare. The trail that had seemed so peaceful before now seemed to feel impossible to get through. We moved quickly, not talking, just focused on getting out. I swear I kept hearing something behind us, footsteps or something following at a distance. But every time I looked back, there was nothing there. We didn't stop until we reached the car, both of us drenched in sweat. As we drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone emerge from the trees behind us. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the dense forest stretching out on either side. Carson and I didn't talk much on the drive home. There wasn't much to say. We both knew what we'd experienced, and there was no rational explanation for it. I haven't been camping since that trip. The thought of sleeping in a tent surrounded by nothing but trees and darkness fills me with a fear I can't quite put into words. I used to love the wilderness, the sense of freedom and peace it brought. But now all I can think about is the silence, the footsteps, and the feeling of being watched.